Wars run on money, and right now that money is only going one way. Every year, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute tracks that growth. And the latest signal is hard to ignore. The world has increased military spending for the 11th year in a row. If you want to understand what's driving it and what it signals for 2026, which has already been an unprecedented year, you're at the right place with the right man. Xiao Liang, a researcher in SIPRI's Military Expenditure and Arms Production Program, works on the data behind this very report. He tracks military spending and the arms industry worldwide. And without his work, SIPRI's 2025 Global Military Spending Report wouldn't have been possible. Xiao, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
It's a pleasure to speaking to you.
Xiao, let me begin with this. Given how volatile geopolitics has become in today's climate, did anything stand out to you while researching for this report for SIPRI?
Yes, so SIPRI data shows that global military spending rose again for the 11th consecutive year in 2025 to almost 2.9 trillion US dollars. This really speaks to the states' reactions to ongoing tensions, wars, and geopolitical uncertainty with large-scale rearmament plans. And we think this trend is probably going to continue given the long-term spending targets and all the military modernization plans by the states. So we will probably see more weapons and more arms in our world through 2026 and beyond.
And I'm curious, when you calculate these figures, are they always based on the absolute numbers that the countries are allocating to their budgets, or do you also refer to trends?
Yeah, so we make every effort to gather as many good as sources as possible from primary sources, from official budgets, states, defense white papers, government announcements, etc. So most of our numbers are based on actual budget or spending numbers from the states. And of course, this depends a lot on the honesty and transparency of governments. So this could vary among countries. There are countries that are more transparent than others. But as a general rule, we take like national official sources to be accurate, and because that reflects government's priority and ambition in funding their military.
And absolutely no surprises here. The United States remains the biggest spender on military. But you've also noted in the report that the gap to the next largest spender is constantly shrinking year on year. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, so last year, the military spending by United States decreased by 70.5%, but this was largely due to cutting aid to Ukraine. And we think this trend will probably reverse in the coming years as the Trump administration is already asking for more funding from Congress. However, what we see more is not the reduction by the US, but more the huge increases by other countries, especially what we call the middle power countries, by investing hugely into their military. This reflects not just the more balanced spending among the biggest countries, but also the US allies' reaction to uncertainties over US alliance in the last year during the Trump administration's pressure on NATO allies.
Yes, I want to come to the allies in a bit, but there is a very important note that you and your team have made on page 3 of your document, which says that the year-on-year decrease for the United States was mainly due to sharp reduction in financial assistance overseas that came from supplemental funding. Now, those of you who are watching our interview, supplemental funding is basically the amount that the government asks for, and this is beyond the initial budget that the Department of Defense is usually approved. And probably Xiao can explain that much better than me. But Xiao, I also want to draw your attention to another report that came in just last week, where US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had said that he's requesting supplemental funding from Congress to help the military in Iran. The number is somewhere around $200 billion. We are not sure yet. But what I'm trying to draw parallels here is that while overseas spending, for example, to Ukraine has definitely reduced, it was just last week that Scott Bessent has said this. So there definitely is like a 2025 versus 2026. Things are changing.
The decline to 2025 for the US was definitely going to be a one-off thing. So from the spending already approved by U.S. Congress for 2026. It has risen to over $1 trillion US dollars, and it will probably go to over 1.5 trillion in 2027 if President Trump's latest budget proposal is accepted, with with ongoing wars in Iran.
Since you referred to the allies also, I want to zoom into the European countries here. And this is something that's extremely interesting in your report, that even the United States spending, military spending, has gone down. Most of its allies' spendings have gone up, and you refer to it because of the constant pressure that coming from Washington. I'll just quickly take you through some of the numbers that our viewers would be interested in. For example, Belgium has probably had the highest change in spending. It's close to 60%, and then Canada is at 23%, Spain is at 50%, Poland is at 23%, Germany is at 24%. All of these big US allies who have now increased their spending exponentially. But this is a trend that you and the other experts were probably predicting, right?
Yeah, so European NATO countries rose the fastest than any time since I think 1980, since the end of the Cold War. So this really reflects like the ongoing pursuit of European self-reliance among increasing pressure from the US and strengthening burden sharing within the alliance. And what we also saw among a lot of the countries you mentioned is a lot of these ambitious spending plans announced since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 started to materialize. So we see actual procurement happening and weapons being delivered. So that explains why a lot of these countries saw huge increases in 2025.
Right, but not the same can be said about the Middle Eastern countries, right? Like Saudi Arabia had just 1.4% change in spending. And then if we come down here in the top 40, we only have Kuwait and Iran. Kuwait had 1.5% increase in spending. And Iran, interestingly, actually reduced its spending by 5.6%. But 2026 had very different realities in store for the Middle Eastern countries, isn't it?
Yeah, we might remember that in 2025, there was a ceasefire reached in Gaza between Hamas and Israel. So there was a reduction of intensity of a lot of conflicts in the Middle East. So that explains like rather slow growth by a lot of countries. In the case of Iran, it was mostly due to its economic difficulties, high inflation, economic pressure that drove down its spending. But with the current war going on in Iran, we think a lot of this trend will probably also reverse in 2026.
And if we specifically talk about Iran as well, as I noted before that the change in spending between 2024 and 2025, Iran has actually seen a reduction of 5.6%. But 2026 is an unprecedented year for Iran. So how is the outlook looking?
Well, the reduction in 2025 was mostly due to high inflation because its spending actually increased by more than 30% in nominal terms. But it had the inflation of almost 50%, so basically canceled out all the increase. But with the current war going on, of course, it will invest more in especially like drones and missiles, which cost a lot. So we'll probably see an uptick in the budget. But one important caveat for Iran is like official figures almost certainly understate the true level of Iran's military power because it uses a lot of what we call off-budget or extra budget oil revenue to finance its military, including like these missiles and drones. So Iran is one of those countries where it's really obscure in terms of military spending.
And this is probably a pure geopolitical question, and I understand that this is not your expertise, but let me put it out there just in case I can absorb something. Iran also funds a lot of these proxy players in the Middle East. Is there any way of tracking that? And does this figure do any justice to that?
I think yes and no. So, of course, Iran spending will be reflected by a lot of these proxy wars in the Middle East. But again, I think that's a part of activity where it's most scrutinized by the West, just like missiles and drones. So that is the part that is most likely to be used by these more obscure and undisclosed sources of revenue, like oil revenue or like funding for the Revolutionary Guard. These are all similar kind of funding that are usually not really publicly disclosed by the Iranian government.
2026, how do you think Middle East would look like?
I think Middle East usually is driven by a couple of its biggest spenders, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So if you look at the current dynamics among these countries, we'll probably see like reduction, maybe, we'll probably see increase in a lot of these countries. So I think as a whole, the region will probably increase as well.
Right. And again, going into specific case studies, Russia, I think, is rather an interesting contradiction here, where you have remarked that this 2025, the year marked the slowest annual rate of growth in Russian military spending since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that started back in 2022. At the same time, you write that its military spending as a share of government spending hit 20%, which is the highest level that SIPRI has said seen for Russia. Could you explain that contradiction for us?
Yes, so the rather slow growth, I guess, speaks to the current state of the war of attrition, and also Russia has also been resorting to more cheaper weapons and cheaper personnel with all the economic sanctions and difficulty in sourcing materials in producing its weapon systems. But at the same time, again, because of the economic pressure, its government spending doesn't really increase, so it has to actually cut a lot of other spending areas like education, health, social spending to fund its military. That explains why the share of government spending as for the military is at its highest, but it also reflects the economic burden.
Interesting. Also, 2025, India became the fifth largest military spender in the entire world. Is it on track? Is this what you were expecting?
Yes. I mean, India was actually ranking between the third and the fourth, I guess around the 2020 or 2022, but it was overtaken by Germany and Russia in the last couple of years for obvious reasons, but not because India wasn't growing. It's still growing steadily, but it was outpaced by Germany due to the big rearmament in Europe, and also obviously by Russia due to the war. So it is still the fifth biggest spender, and I think its spending increased by almost 9% in 2025. So I think the current modernization drive by the Indian government is still going on.
Also, something that I found very interesting with the report, something that caught my eye while tracking the military spending in respect to the country's GDP, is that Ukraine, of course, is the clear winner, as expected, that about 40% of its annual budget goes straight towards its military. The second biggest spender is Algeria, with 8.8% of its GDP dedicated to military between 2016 and 2025. It has risen about 89%. What are we missing here? What's happening in Algeria?
So Algeria's spending is mostly driven by two things. One is its conflict with Morocco regarding West Sahara. And in 2025, there was the UN resolution that recognized part of Morocco's claim, which really drove up Algeria's reaction and spending. At the same time, Algeria is similar to many other countries in the Middle East and North Africa, where its spending depends a lot on oil and natural gas revenue. And in 2025, because of all the other wars going on in the Middle East and Europe, oil prices really drove up, and a lot of European countries were sourcing oil now from Algeria, which helps them to hike their spending that much.
But explain this, oil spending and military spending, how are they related?
A lot of these oil-rich countries, their decision on military spending depends a lot on how much revenue they get from natural resources that year. So usually these governments would actually spend more on the military when the oil prices is high and the revenue is good, because it might be more difficult for them to cut other parts of the spending, because you might also know a lot of these countries are really good, like social welfare systems. But military is rather more fungible and flexible part where they can cut or increase depending on the revenue they get from natural resources.
What about North Korea? Do we have any data that we can access?
No. So there's no data at all on North Korea's military spending. I think they published a national budget every year, but they always say they're spending the same level on the military, which is not very trustworthy. And of course, its nuclear program will not be disclosed at all. So I don't think there's any public open sources on North Korea's military.
Right. Also, SIPRI has been looking at global military numbers since about 1960s, if I'm not wrong. Do you have discussions about the future outlook? Like these numbers, as you correctly pointed out that these are all official figures that you have accessed. And I can also see asterisks where you are saying that there could be a discrepancy. For example, Ukraine is at war, so we don't exactly know what's happening. The same case with Iran. In case of North Korea, it's probably a black box. But if you do, has 2025 performed the way you guys, the best in the business that is, had predicted?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah, you're right. Like some of our countries are estimating numbers because of geopolitical or some of the numbers are estimated because of political reasons or the countries not being transparent. But I think we have good numbers, at least over 95% of most countries of the biggest spenders in the world. So we can say with pretty good certainty that our numbers reflect the military and geopolitical trends happening in the world. So I think what we saw in 2025 was also very accurate in terms of huge increases in Europe and Asia, but was a bit canceled out by reductions in the US. But that was mostly due to cutting aid to Ukraine, which was what happened in 2025. And we also probably see the trend will reverse in the coming years.
I know we are just 4 months into this year, but given so much has already happened, can you give us a sneak peek into how this very report of 2026 would look like?
Well, I think in the expectation for 2026 is with NATO's new spending target of almost 5% of GDP and the ongoing war in the Middle East, spending will probably go up even further. But we could see, for example, if a ceasefire was reached in the Middle East or in Ukraine, it could slow some spendings down. But I think in the long term, given a lot of these plans are not just about the current conflict, but more like long-term geopolitical uncertainty and tensions, the trend will probably continue.
All right. And these days, peace is not always permanent peace. Xiao Liang from SIPRI, thank you so much for joining us on this show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.